All right, well, we'll go ahead and start, noting that some people will be coming from the other presentation and joining us. But for our Zoom people, just to explain to them that there's another presentation going on at the same time. So that's why you'll see people coming in. I want to mention next week, I like to always plug what's coming up next week, and it will be Pastor Ryan and some of our governing elders are going to be talking to us about, their topic is a season of weekly communion. And this will be an opportunity to hear about the discernment process that they've been going through, and a chance to ask questions and discuss, and to see what's coming up with that. So that will be great. Today, our speaker is Michael St. Marie. And he also happened to be our liturgist today, as you know. Michael is in his second year at Western Theological Seminary, and he's also a ministry support intern, is what we're calling it, at Third. Michael is from Clarkston, Washington, and received his bachelor's in theology from Whitworth University in Spokane. His special interests include ecological theology and also the early church. And welcome, Michael. We're so glad you're here, and thanks for waiting around for us.
As Laura introduced, my name is Michael St. Marie, and today I'll be focusing on the second of those interests, the early church. Where I'll be talking about the practices of peacemaking that the early church had, and ways that those can be models for us as we think about peacemaking in the church today. So, there are several components of that topic that I'll go over in order. So I'll start with a brief introduction to what restorative justice is, for anyone who's unfamiliar with the concept. And then I will move to looking at a few practices that the early church had, and discuss ways that they both are and are not similar to what we would call restorative justice today. And then finally, I'll turn and look and see what we can gain as we think about our practices of peacemaking in the church. So first, we'll talk about what restorative justice is. Now, before we can approach the topic of what restorative justice is, we need to back up a step and ask, what do we mean when we're talking about justice? There are two primary kinds of justice that we distinguish between. The first is primary justice, and the second is corrective justice. Primary justice talks about the state of being of a society, one where everyone gets what they are due. The second kind of justice, corrective justice, talks about what do we do when something goes wrong? How do we bring things back into a case of primary justice? So, when we look at how do we bring things back into right order, there are several different ways that gets talked about. I'll discuss two briefly. The first is criminal justice, which is what we often use in the United States, and then I'll look at restorative justice. Under the practice of criminal justice, something is unjust. It's defined as such if it breaks certain laws and rules. And then when someone has broken one of those rules, they have unbalanced the scales of justice, thus they've caused a harm both to a person and to our society. And in order to rebalance those scales of justice, they must be punished in an equal amount to the harm that they caused, ideally an equal amount. Under this system, the harm that was caused is not directly addressed. Rather, a new harm is caused in the life of the perpetrator. Restorative justice provides an alternative way to thinking about corrective justice. It focuses on the realm of injustice that is a harm done to an individual, community, or relationship. Since it is more focused on harms than on breaking laws, its focus is also on healing those harms. There are several aspects to healing harms that have been caused that are listed out in practices of restorative justice. The ones I'm going to talk about today are acknowledgement, apology, reparations, punishment, forgiveness, and building more just institutions. This list is not exhaustive, but it is a good starting point for thinking about what is healing and what makes a process restorative. Acknowledgement and apology are similar, but not quite the same thing. It's one thing for me to acknowledge that stealing someone's wallet hurt them, but it's another thing for me to apologize for stealing their wallet. But what both of these have in common is that I must talk to the person who I harmed. This is a central element of restorative justice, encounter between the several parties that were injured in a situation of injustice. Reparations is one of the first things we might think about when we think about how to restore relationships that have been harmed by injustice. If I've stolen someone's wallet and there's to be any chance of us having a good relationship, I need to give them back their wallet. Now, punishment, as I talked about in the beginning, we might more associate with punitive or criminal justice than with restorative justice. But there is room for the possibility of punishment in certain forms of restorative justice. Sometimes punishment can be necessary to heal harms. But what is important to be kept in mind is that punishment should not be done for the sake of balancing some scales of arbitrary harm, but for the goal of healing relationships. And then, of course, forgiveness is the ideal end of restorative justice. This is the restored relationship that is being sought after. Forgiveness is not always achieved in restorative justice practices, but it is through forgiveness that relationships are made whole. Often the location of all of the aspects I just talked about is what is called a restorative circle. In this, all of the parties that are involved in a situation are brought together. The victim of an offense, the one who perpetrated that offense, community members who are impacted, leaders in the community that can help navigate the situation. In this circle, this is a place where all parties involved are given time to speak their mind, to describe the hurt that they were caused and what they experienced in an event, and then also the group together works on what is necessary to restore relationship and bring wholeness back. The final aspect of restorative justice is the broader scale goal of building more just institutions. Under this practice, it's recognized that the most likely reason I might have for stealing someone's wallet is that I am in hunger or in need. If we want a society where less people are harmed, we need a society that is more just, where people don't need to cause harms in order to survive. This is sometimes called a transformative view of restorative justice. But we'll talk about it in one of our early church practices, and our other two will focus on the more practical practices of restorative justice. Now, a bit of history on the origins of restorative justice. There are two main fountainheads for restorative justice that people point to. The first is the work of the Mennonite and other peace churches who practiced some of these forms originally, and the second is indigenous forms of repairing relationships. For the sake of the paper today, I won't be able to go into all of these, but they have incredibly rich histories. The peacemaking circles of the First Nations peoples, Maori practices of Wahanu, and Ubuntu-based reconciliation in Africa are all very powerful sources for thinking about restorative justice. And what these practices show is that restorative justice has deep roots in many different societies and cultures and ways of being. Practices that were pushed aside by the colonists who thought that their systems of punitive corrective justice were the only way of doing things. Because of the way that colonists forced practices of criminal justice and Christianity at the same time onto Native peoples, and along with that, certain forms of punitive ways of thinking about theology, there are those who argue that the practices of restorative justice run counter to Christianity, and that Christianity gets in the way of restorative justice. However, as I pointed out, some of the earliest activities that were called restorative justice were practiced by the Mennonites in Canada, who started what became called victim-offender reconciliation programs. These were some of the first forms of restorative circles that I talked about earlier. These Christians were inspired by their historic pacifism and the practices of the First Nations peoples to find alternative forms of reconciliation to the harm that is caused by the prison system. This program, the Victim Offender Reconciliation Program, has received immense success and is even practiced by certain courts around the US and in Michigan today. Now, so there are those who, looking at that Mennonite practice, there are those who say that for the Mennonites to practice that represented a radical shift in Christian thinking, and in some ways it did. But what I want to present today is a few practices of the early church that show similarity to the practices of restorative justice, and demonstrates that there are roots for restorative justice deep within the Christian tradition, even if they were buried for a time. So, the first practice that we'll talk about is in the broad category of thinking about a transformation of society to something that is more just. This was mainly sought after in the early church through what is called catechesis, or training. Catechesis was an important part of the life of the early church. It was how Christian values and ideals were imparted to new believers. And it reshaped the way that people thought, to act and live in line with the way of Jesus. This formation took place in many different ways: treatises, homilies, living life together with those who were further along in their Christian journey. Here, I will discuss briefly two different writings of catechesis that focus on making their readers more peaceable people. With these works, there's less room to directly compare them to the practical practices of restorative justice, but we can think about the ways that they were seeking a transformed way of being in society. The first was written by Clement of Alexandria. Clement lived in the 2nd century, and one of his most famous works is called the Pedagogus, or Teaching. In this, he sets forth practical teachings on what the life of the Christian ought to look like, particularly in relationship to the pagan culture that was around them. The goal of this reading is to teach his readers and to tune them into what he calls an instrument made for peace. Clement's teachings here are about temperance, modesty, and social living. And they have the goal of forming Christians to be people who are at peace with those around them. For Clement, living at peace is a holistic character formation. As such, he admonishes readers in very simple things that they ought not to fidget too much, to cross their legs at the dinner table or rest their chin on their hands. These actions might not seem to us to be linked directly to being at peace, but he prefaces them by saying, this teaching is for those who wish to attend pagan banquets, quote, for charity's sake. Now, Clement would prefer these banquets not be attended at all. But if you are going to attend them, he says, respect for the host and the other guests is important. You should not be causing unnecessary quarrels. Clement continues his instruction with the call to be equally temperate in speech. He says, quote, it is my opinion that a limit should be imposed upon the speech, end quote. But this is not an arbitrary limit on speech, for he goes on to say, do not let quarrelsomeness, with its love of empty victory, creep into our midst, for our aim is the elimination of all discord. Surely this is the meaning of the expression, peace be unto you. This shows the purpose of Clement's teaching on manners. It is all about living at peace with those around you. He summarizes his definition of the Christian as a person of quietness, gentleness, of serenity, and of peace. The best way to live at peace with those around you is to not create discord. For if you do not create discord, there is no need to make peace. So in Clement, we find an early teacher of the church writing a text with the goal of making Christians more peaceful people, people who seek to end conflict or even not start it in the first place, in whom every facet of their lives, even their presence at a dinner table, is affected by Christ's life. Next, we'll turn to Gregory of Nyssa, who wrote a homily on the line in Matthew, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." This homily is focused on what does it mean to be a peacemaker and what is the goal, what is like to be called a child of God. Part of the sermon then is just on the goodness of being called a child of God. And also he then says, but peace in and of itself is good even before you're called a child of God. Then he turns to the more practical question of what is a peacemaker. He summarizes as a peacemaker as a man who gives peace to another. But one cannot give another what one does not possess oneself. So peacemaking is the act of giving out of the abundance of peace that one possesses in one's life. He goes on to describe war, wrath, envy, and hypocrisy as the illnesses that can be treated through peacemaking. Thus, at once, peacemaking is about violence and war, and also our interpersonal interactions with one another. Those who practice this task of peacemaking are called children of God, according to Gregory, because one who eliminates such a disease from a man's life and unites the members of the human race by peace and goodwill truly performs a work of divine power. He imitates the true God who endows human life with those blessings. This is why for Gregory, he can describe this beatitude, blessed are the peacemakers, as the holy of holies. He compares it to the pinnacle of the mountain or the center of the temple. At the outset, Gregory does a whole series of homilies on all of the Beatitudes. And at the start, he writes that they are like a mountain, one that Jesus is leading us up and pointing out the path to climb and the blessings that are there along the way. Thus, for Gregory, peacemaking becomes the pinnacle of this mountain. It is a result of all of the virtues of the Beatitudes that one is able to live a life of peace. So what both of these authors show is a commitment to peace as a way of life. Their goal is to form Christians to be people of peace in a world of violence. They have a vision of a different way the world could be, and they believe that moral formation can help make that world a reality. This same moral imagination that they expressed is what compelled the Mennonites to try something new other than the criminal justice system. So now that we've looked at that, we'll turn to what this catechesis looked like in the practice of the church. The first practice that we're going to look at is one very common throughout all of the early church and still practiced today, and that is the passing of the peace, or then, as it was called, the kiss of peace, because it was a moment where the congregation would share a kiss. So, Cyril of Jerusalem, who is a leader from the 4th century in the church, describes the role of the kiss within the service as one that affects unity within the congregation. He writes, "You must not suppose that this kiss is the kiss customarily exchanged in the streets by ordinary friends, affecting as it does a commingling of souls and mutually pledging unreserved forgiveness, a sight of true union of hearts, banishing every grudge." So here he links this kiss of peace directly with forgiveness and making peace within the community, not just as an aspect of Christian life, but as a central facet of the worship of the church. As alluded to by Clement, there was a concept of kissing as a greeting that predated the Christian kiss. But its association as a kiss of peace is a uniquely Christian idea. Those words are not found linked together anywhere in the pagan world. It is intimately linked with the church's understanding of what it means to be in communion with one another. This kiss we see called for in several of the epistles in the New Testament, where it is connected to the fellowship of the community. While in Scripture there's no indication of where or how this kiss is to take place, it was practiced mainly in the church, and it was practiced outside of worship in the church as well. It was mainly practiced in worship before the sharing of the Eucharist. Here it is that Cyril speaks about it actually affecting peace within the community. What one finds when one tries to look for a theology of the kiss of peace in the early church is that they didn't write much theology about it. It was commanded as a good Christian practice, and it was practiced as part of the liturgy. But the theological background behind it didn't need to be expressed. What is clear is that Christians were attempting to create a new kind of unity through the kiss of peace. So, if we want to look at the ways in which this is restorative, we have to stretch our imagination a little bit because it's less clearly defined the exact practice of the kiss. But we can note a few key things. First, it took place in encounter. In order for a kiss to be exchanged, you have to be in proximity to someone. This kiss also enacts the new kind of world it envisions, a world of living peace. It is certainly possible that this practice also could include other restorative elements: acknowledgement, apology, forgiveness, potentially even reparations. It's unclear if those elements were directly involved in the early church's practice of the kiss, though. One could certainly imagine if it is to affect the kind of commingling of souls that Cyril says that it should, that it would at least include some of those elements, but we cannot know for sure. Now, there's also some ways in which this practice might not be a true restorative justice practice. As I just noted, the simple practice of sharing a kiss does not inherently include actual healings of the harms that were done. This could be what Isaiah calls for when people say, peace, peace, but there is no actual peace. In fact, with the stress on it being a part of the church service, there could be a sense of pressure caused on people to make peace when they are not actually at peace. Also, it is true that if it is only practiced in the context of a worship service, it doesn't necessarily give room for a dialogue to take place among the parties. Now, these problems do not mean that the kiss of peace cannot be restorative, but it alone is not enough to be a restorative practice. Its place is as one aspect of a communal way of living into peace and restorative justice. Now, the last practice I'm going to turn to is perhaps one that is less familiar. It comes from a text called the Didascalia. The Didascalia is a 3rd century text that was written in Syria. It has been described by some as a handbook for ecclesial practice. The goal of this book is to help bishops and other church leaders lead their congregation well. And in this text, there is a lot of space devoted to the importance of peace within the church body. The main basis for this centrality of peacemaking is Matthew 5:23. If you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your sibling has anger against you, leave your gift before the altar and go. First be reconciled with your brother, then come offer your gift. This verse is taken very literally by the author of the Didascalia, who says, if you pray 3 times an hour, you have no advantage, for you are not heard because of your enmity towards your brother. Being at peace with your siblings is a prerequisite for proper worship in the community that this text was written for. And it is the job of the bishop and leaders of the church to teach this life of peace in their community. In the pursuit of peace, there is a formula that is laid out for a peacemaking practice when there is discord in the body. During the service, it is described, the deacon is to stand up and say, is there anyone who is keeping any grudge against his fellow? If anyone does, they are to make peace, immediately if possible. And this is perhaps, some speculate, where a kiss of peace might be shared. However, if they cannot make peace then, the text says Monday is the next best option. The 2 parties are to go to the bishop on Monday if they cannot settle their dispute on their own. And the bishop is to judge the matter without respect of persons, regardless of their position or station or wealth or any other factor. The goal of this meeting is that peace might be made between the 2 parties. However, since the author of the Didascalia knew that not all situations might be solved so easily, the bishop is given the authority to remove one of the members from the congregation if they find that person to be an unrepentant sinner. What is unique about this text, though, is when that person is excommunicated, the text says the bishop should still walk with that person, with the goal of bringing them into repentance and then back into communion with the body. There are several warnings throughout the text that the bishop must be very careful in their judgments and should not be quick to judge harshly. For it is a great sin if they send out any from the church who has not done wrong. The goal of this practice is that both the individuals in the church and the whole flock might be kept whole and in unity. This process has many similarities to restorative justice. One of the primary ways that this process is restorative is that it is based in encounter. The 2 parties come together to share their side of the story. And this discussion is to be facilitated by someone who is seen as a leader and a figure to look up to in the community. The text does not give explicit instructions for how the bishop is to bring about resolution to the conflict, but it does ensure that it should be a neutral process. Social status, wealth, relationship to the bishop, all should not factor into their decision. Since the text admonishes bishops to be loving and righteous, and God the Father is loving and righteous, the ideal reconciliation from this process would be one that seeks the good of all parties involved. Another aspect of this process that makes it restorative is its goal, which is the restoration of community. There is potential punishment, in this case excommunication, either just from the Eucharist or from the whole service, depending on the wrongdoing. But even that punishment has the goal of bringing that person back into the community of faith. There are also some aspects, of course, of this practice that do not align with the means and goals of restorative justice. The most notable of these is the role of the bishop in the process of reconciliation. The bishop has extreme authority, and while they might take into account the things that were said by both parties, it is ultimately up to them to decide what action they will take. Thus, it's not primarily a victim-led process like restorative justice is meant to be, but a bishop-led process. Now, if the bishop is living righteously and truly listening to the members of their community, this might not affect the outcome of the process, but it does leave the door open for abuses of power to take place. The second major difference in these two, between this and restorative justice, is the role of fear in the process. In describing the person who is cast out on the bishop's judgment, it says, "He is cast out from life and from everlasting glory. He is rejected by men and found guilty before God." For the author, salvation is found in the church. And so being cut out of the church is the worst thing that can happen. And desiring to remain in the church for the sake of salvation ought to keep people in community. If this were a fully restorative process, fear would not be one of the primary emotions driving the actions. So, those are our practices, and now we'll turn to look at what does this mean for us today. If we know that there are roots for restorative justice in some of the practices of the early church, how does that affect how we live? What would it look like to implement in some way some of the processes I just described? I want to take a little bit of time to imagine, with the same imagination of Clement and Gregory, the same imagination as the Mennonites. Let's start with what seems to be the easiest place, the passing of the peace. This is a practice we already do in our church, and churches around the country and the world do today. Does our passing of the peace have the same effect that Cyril described? Does it actually bring about the commingling of our hearts together? Does the passing of the peace bring about peace in the community? If not, what could we do to make it so? I do not want to propose that we change our whole liturgy to make passing of the peace a half-hour-long process where we can hash out any issues in the church. But could we change the way that we ourselves approach this time in the liturgy? Are there people that we know we are not at peace with as we pass the peace to them every Sunday? Could we invite that person over for dinner? Could we find a time to try and sit down with them, perhaps with a trusted leader, and try and effect actual peace? I do not want to suppose that every situation is as simple as this, but I think with the help of the early church, we can imagine new ways of being and living. A large part of imagining new ways of being comes out of how we are formed. For the early church, catechesis was a huge deal because of the fact that the Roman way of life and the Christian way of life were vastly different. So it took people time to learn this new way of being. In some places, you had to spend 3 years as in catechesis before you could be a fully professed Christian. One of the things that they had to learn was how to live at peace, not only with Christians, but with non-Christians as well. We do not have this long, extended process of catechesis in our church culture, nor do I think we necessarily need 3 years of training for someone to be called a Christian or to be baptized. But we ought not to forget that the Christian way that Jesus calls us to is not the same thing as the standard American life. If we want to be people of peace in a world of violence, then we need to be trained in the ways of peace. We have to practice this skill. Just like any other thing that the church wants to accomplish in the world, If we cannot do it within our own walls, we will not be able to do it in the world. Finally, I want to turn to the peacemaking practice in the Didascalia. I saved this one for the last because it's the most different from the way that we do church today. But I think there are helpful things that could be learned from it. We do not have bishops, but we do not have public declarations of when members are in conflict in the church. We can't drop everything in our lives for a Monday morning meeting with the pastor if there's discord. But could we, in cases of disagreement, go to our pastor or another trusted leader in the church to help us sort out the issue? Perhaps that is a thing that some have already done. Can we find ways to walk with those who we would describe as outside of the church more directly, even those that we think have cut themselves off from the church by their own actions? We do not need to try and save them, but can we walk alongside them in living peacefully? Today I have demonstrated that there are several practices of the early church that resemble restorative justice practices as it is practiced today. These are not perfect representations of restorative justice, but they show that it has roots in the Christian tradition that go back to the very beginning. I hope I have also shown some ways in which we might recapture some of the ideas and practices for our own today. Through their faithful imagining of a better world and our faithful reimagining, we can come to be a people of peace in a world of violence. Thank you.
Questions or comments? Michael, I have one. This isn't the early church, but you mentioned Michigan restorative justice and programs that have worked. Did you do any research at all into what we're talking about there?
So I've done a little bit. I took a class on restorative justice with Dr. David Stubbs at Western, and he was describing that there are some courts in Michigan that for certain smaller crimes will assign restorative justice type practices or restorative circles as community building, especially for like smaller things like vandalism. Oftentimes then the punishment that the restorative circle devises is, well, the person who vandalized is going to go clean the store that they vandalized and then maybe do some other volunteer work for a little while. It's still not a very common practice anywhere in the US, but especially, for smaller crimes, there's an interest in it, and it is allowed by the court system as a reasonable practice for those smaller cases.
Thank you.
You had mentioned restorative justice practices by a number of different, more indigenous communities, and I wonder if you could just flesh out a little bit more what any one or some of those look like.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one was, I think it was Peacemaking Circles of the First Nations Peoples. That was the one most directly that inspired restorative circles. So it involves the elder of the tribe and members of the tribe sitting around, and this has been practiced also with judicial systems involved in Canada as a practice for bringing about justice. And it is that sort of circle where everyone gets to share how they were affected by what was done and then go back around and say what they think needs to be done to restore justice. The Maori practice of wahanu is it's a more involved practice and involves words in Maori that I don't know, but it involves like the way that their like sweat lodges work and like coming into it and you're sharing breath with one another, and that practice as that involves like both parties sharing the story of their family up to the event and then also the event and how that impacts their larger community, and then brings about through the guidance of the chief and the elders of the tribe, healing for that relationship. And then Ubuntu, which is from some places in Africa, is the belief, it's a belief that informs restorative justice practices. It essentially can be summarized as, in the West, we have Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am. Ubuntu says, I am in relationship with other people, therefore I am. And so it's this belief that we are defined by our relationships and our community around us. And so if we are defined by our relationships and our community around us, then the goal of justice should be repairing those relationships in that community around us. So that belief has led to different types of practices than we have in the West with our sort of more individual and sort of rational mind approach to what a human being is.
When you were describing the process, Michael, one of the examples that popped into my mind was South Africa and what happened after Mandela was released and the ANC came back, won elections. I can't put all those pieces together in my mind, but I know that was a process that did have some restorative justice elements to it, but it feels like it's kind of fallen apart.
Yeah, so the specific practice, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which is what was put together in South Africa, is sort of lauded as one of the peak examples of restorative justice being done on a nationwide scale, because the goal of it, and when it was practiced well, was people who were harmed by the apartheid regime coming before the council and sharing their experience, and then even just the being given the space to share what had happened and the truth to come out. Another person's list of like what is restorative justice involves the truth of the situation being told and the what is called the standing victory of injustice being torn down. So when a harm is caused, in this case of South Africa, on like a national scale, something like apartheid, or on an individual scale, someone stole my wallet. If that is allowed to stand, that is, injustice is winning. And so by this process, either nationally or individually, the truth coming out and the victory of that injustice being torn down in and of itself before any other healing processes can just itself be healing for the people who were harmed, because it says, like, as a community, we're acknowledging that this is wrong, what happened. And then from that point, then you can move to, well, what is the next steps? Is it some form of punishment for the person who did wrong? Is it reconciliation between the parties? What does that look like? You can move forward from there. But you have to start with that foundation of the truth being told and injustice not having a lasting victory.
Michael, obviously you are impassioned about as a scholar. I'm interested in knowing, how are you getting involved as a bishop?
So I took a class on restorative justice in the fall that was part of Western Theological Seminary's prison education program at Muskegon Correctional Facility. So I took that class up at the facility with inmates. And that is where I learned about restorative justice, which is a fantastic setting to be learning about restorative justice. It was incredibly hard and incredibly wonderful. I think one of the biggest things that, when it comes to practically living it out, is finding community and living into it. So there is an organization that some people at Western are connected to, Movement West Michigan, which helps support people in all kinds of struggling situations, particularly immigrants as they're moving into the country, get settled in. And even like practices like that are before a specific injustice has happened are part of that trying to build more just institutions aspect of restorative justice, and trying to say, this, you are coming here into this place, how can we help you just, like, what is due to someone when they come into the country, and how do we help give that to them? How do we provide that for them? So I think organizations like that are incredibly important to get involved with, and help you be deeply connected to the community that you then, out of those relationships, that's how you can then practice something more restorative justice-like. Because you can't do restorative justice if you don't have prior relationships with the people that you're trying to do restorative justice with. You have to have that foundation of community trust and of relationship for this process to work at all.
Michael, thank you. In the work that I do in K-12 schools, we do a lot of training with teachers around restorative practices. So one thing that that connected with what you said is when we work with teachers, we talk about proactive and reactive, right? Which I'm sure you're familiar with. And one of the things we talk about is 80% if we focus 80% of our attention on proactive relationship building, and you were talking about this, then that 20% becomes the reactive, where we need to seek reconciliation and restoration. And one thing I'm always struck by is in schools that I work with, that this is part of their identity. It's part of their practice. Every morning, classrooms are starting with these proactive circles, like you were talking about, where we're going around and we're building this connection amongst the community. We see a direct decrease in the need for the reactive reconciliation kind of restorative practices. And I think about kids, and I think about the setting you were in with seminary at the prison, and it just makes me wonder, for people who are in a place where they are navigating hard circumstances, what would have life looked like for them if they had been in a church community or a school community where we were intentionally focusing on those restorative practices before there were ever any issues. So even the point of passing of the peace, to see that as a proactive measure of connection and community building within a church community, just really appreciated that direct connection and marveled at, how many years ago we were talking about this. So just appreciate you making that connection. No necessarily question, but just appreciate that.
I will actually speak to something there. I've, for one of my small papers for that class, spoke with a couple of teachers who mentioned sort of some aversion to the statement of restorative circles, because it sort of is, in some places, has been practiced as administration says, now you're going to do restorative circles. And then all that really leads to is, well, the student who's causing problems, they're going to sit down and talk with the counselor or the principal and get a lollipop and go back to the room when they say they're sorry for what they've done. And that's what happens when you don't spend 80% of your time on that proactive, because you have to have buy-in to the system. If you're going to do it in a church, you have to have buy-in to a system. If you're going to do it in a community, you have, having people who are invested and care about maintaining those relationships and keep building that trust and keeping that peace, then you can actually see really great effects from it. But if it's just sort of now we're going to do this, and then it does sort of tend to fall apart a little bit.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Michael. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.